It's awesome to know that there's a God who cares about every little detail of our life. I am so glad that you have stayed for the second part of this study, because I find this to be one of the most fascinating things in the Bible. In the book of Revelation, there's a whole lot of imagery, of representation, but when we get into what's going to be studied the rest of this morning, this really gets my attention, and I hope that it will yours as well. This is where we see that a loving God gives us a heads up. He loves us so much that he gives us a heads up and says, hey, this is what I want you to look for. So part 2 of today, we are going to be having David come up. I want to just remind everyone that in the back afterwards, we will be... for those of you that attend here regularly, we will be continuing on to support our church budget, and our deacons will be in the back there as well for that. Also, tomorrow evening, at what time? 6:30. Tomorrow evening, we will be right back here. Each and every one of you are invited to continue on in our study through this book. And once again, thanks so much for being here today. I hope that you are blessed in part 2. David, you are on.
Jamie, you sing great. You sing really good too. What's your name? Sarah. One of my friends is named Dave Bellow, and I used to always sing, "His eye is on Dave Bellow." And sometimes you can switch it up. You can sing, "His eye is on this fellow." You can just mix it up. That sounded awesome. Thank you for that. If I was a judge on some show, I'd give you a thumbs up. I'd give you a big thumbs up. That was beautiful. What an amazing God who possesses the power to keep the universe operating with all of its power and symmetry and beauty, and yet is aware of a little sparrow. And I'm particularly interested in sparrows because I'm a bird watcher. Anybody else out there bird watchers? Anybody else willing to admit it? All right, we are in Revelation chapter 13, the two beasts. And we're going to start right away with prayer. This is going to be great fun and some big information here, but it's going to be in many ways a continuation of Revelation chapter 12, because these three chapters, 12, 13, and 14, form the big banana together. They form the corpus of the pinnacle, the summit of the whole point of Revelation. Here we find this cosmic conflict that is taking place behind the scenes in all the rest of Revelation. So Revelation chapter 13 is a very logical and organized continuation of the principles that were laid down in 12. So the principles are laid down in 12, and we're going to see the earthly manifestation of those principles in chapter 13. Great stuff. Father in heaven, please be with us now. Your eye is on the sparrow, and your eye is on us as well. Be with us now as we turn our attention to Scripture, we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so let's talk about the two beasts. In order to do that, we're going to start with our slide. That's our first slide. Every night, what does it say? The book of Revelation is about Jesus Christ. Very good. In fact, it is. Let's go to Revelation chapter 13. And in Revelation chapter 13, we find two beasts. Two beasts. And the first beast goes all the way down to verse 10, and the second beast goes from verse 11 to the end of the chapter in verse 18. Now, before we read Revelation chapter 13, I want you to see Revelation chapter 12, verse 17 again. That's what we just ended on a moment ago. It says, "And the dragon," the defeated, wounded grizzly bear is my illustration here. He's bleeding fast. He knows he's dying. He knows his moments are numbered. "The dragon was enraged with the woman and went to make war with the rest of her offspring who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus." This idea of a remnant or of a residue, a few that remained, is a saturative theme in the Old Testament. We find it again and again. For example, Noah was a remnant when much of the world had gone astray. And there were Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were remnants of Judah when they were captive in Babylon. When Israel was carried away into Assyrian captivity, a remnant remained. So this is a very consistent biblical theme. Jesus even used that same idea to refer to his disciples. He said to the disciples in Luke chapter 12, verse 32, "Do not be afraid, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give to you the kingdom. Do not be afraid, you are a remnant in Israel. And so this is not a new idea, it's not a new concept. When it says at the end of Revelation chapter 12 that the dragon, the defeated dragon, was enraged and went to wreak as much havoc as he could on that residue, the remnant of God's people that remains, verse 17 ends chapter 12, and chapter 13 introduces us to two beasts, two nations, two powers, this is key, that are the means by which that war is waged. I'm going to say that again because you might have been whispering and not getting it. Revelation 12:17 is the war against God's people at the end. Revelation 13 gives two beasts that are the means by which that war is prosecuted. Two powers will be employed. Two powers that operate on satanic principles will be employed to, not just in some general or philosophical sense, wage a war against God's people, but in a very real and palpable and even an economic sense, wage war against God's people. Now, let's read about this first beast, Revelation chapter 13. We're going to spend most of our time not on the first beast because there is, I wouldn't say theological consensus, but there is a strong amount of consensus, near consensus by Protestant Bible expositors as to who the first beast is. The first beast is not tricky, especially with the background that we already have from the book of Daniel. The first beast will yield his identity to us very quickly. So we'll spend, I don't know, probably 10 minutes, which whenever I say 10, I really mean 20. So we'll spend 10 minutes on the first beast, and then we'll spend the last 20 minutes, by which I mean 40, on the second beast. John says, then I stood on the sand of the sea. That sounds very Danielic already. Daniel stood on the sand of the sea. This imagery already calls to mind the Old Testament prophecies of Daniel. Now, this is going to further call to mind the Old Testament prophecies of Daniel, especially chapter 7. And I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, very Danielic, having 7 heads and 10 horns. Okay, that's straight out of Daniel, but watch this. And on his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name. Now the beast which I saw was like a leopard. His feet were like the feet of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave this guy his power, his throne, and his great authority. The first thing we want to notice here is that this imagery is lifted straight from Daniel chapter 7, all of it. In Daniel chapter 7, Daniel stood there on the shores of the Mediterranean, the Great Sea, and he looked out in symbolic vision, and he saw in vision 4 beasts come up from the Great Sea. The first beast that he saw was a lion. Then he saw a bear. Then he saw a leopard, and then he saw a terrible beast that he couldn't easily describe, having 7 heads and 10 horns. This is crucial that you get the order. When Daniel was back here looking forward into what was for him the future, he saw these beasts, symbolic powers. The beast is used here to describe nations and aggressive, hostile, worldly nations. He saw them as a lion, Babylon, as a bear, Medo-Persia, as a leopard, a 4-headed leopard, Greece, and he saw them as a terrible, ferocious beast with 7 heads and 10 horns, Rome. So Daniel's looking forward, and he sees Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, in that order. Lion, bear, leopard, terrible beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. Now this is key. John, who's living here now, John's living in the 1st century. Daniel was living some 600 years before the 1st century. So John, who's living here, when he describes this beast, notice the order that he describes it in. He says, I saw a beast coming up with 7 heads and 10 horns. And then he says it had, let's look at this. Look at verse 2. 7 heads and 10 horns. What's the next thing he says? It had, where am I at here? Verse 2. Now the beast I saw was like a leopard. His feet were like the feet of a bear, and his mouth was like the mouth of a lion. This is a very cool, a subtle but cool indicator that what was future for Daniel was largely history for John. When Daniel looks forward, he sees the lion of Babylon, the bear of Medo-Persia, the leopard of Greece, and the terrible beast of Rome. When John, who was living during the time of the terrible beast of Rome, when he describes the beast coming up, he describes them in reverse order. The terrible beast of Rome, the leopard of Greece, the bear of Medo Persia, and the lion of Babylon. Daniel looking forward into prophecy, John looking backward into history. So already we are keenly aware that the taproot of this prophecy is Daniel chapter 7. All of the prophecies of Daniel in general, and specifically chapter 7. Verse 3. Now, I saw one of his heads, one of these 7 heads, as if it had been mortally wounded, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world marveled and followed the beast. So the beast endures a woundedness, but it's a woundedness that is quickly remedied, and then the world wanders in admiration after the beast. Verse 4. So they worshipped the dragon who gave authority to the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, who is like the beast? Who is able to make war with him? This is right back to our theme from chapter 12 of the myth of redemptive violence. All of these beasts are predatory beasts, right? You've got a lion, a bear, a leopard, and some crazy beast with iron teeth and 7 heads and 10 horns. They're predatory, right? And that is the history of nations. The history of nations is that one power conquers the next one, and then that power is conquered by another one, and that power is conquered by another one. That's the world we live in even today. There are right now on earth today 10 wars taking place and 64 major international conflicts right now today. And these are basically warlike creatures. I mean, when a beast is selected for a nation, nobody's like, we're the koala. We'll be the koala. Oh, you're going to be the koala? I wanted to be the koala. Okay, we'll be the worm. Oh, you're going to be the worm? I wanted to be the worm. Well, you can be the butterfly. No. We're not dealing with cuddly, sweet, beautiful. These are lions, bears, leopards, and ferocious beasts that are conquering. They're operating on the basic principles that might makes right, and power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And if you can get away with something and you have the might to do so, you do it. Right? So that's what's happening here, and John sees it. But he sees one of those heads on that 7-headed beast that's mortally wounded. Verse 4, they're like, who could make war with this beast? This beast is amazing, it's powerful, it's unstoppable. Verse 5, and he was given a mouth, speaking great things and blasphemies. Here, watch this. And he was given authority to continue 42 months, 1,260 days, prophetic days, literal years. Okay, we know who this is. Already, it's as plain as the noonday sun. As soon as we were directed to Daniel chapter 7, we were ready for it. And then we're told that he's a blasphemous beast. Okay, now we're ready for it. And then we're told how long he reigns. Okay, we already know who it is if we know anything about Daniel chapters 7 and 8. Watch this, though. Verse 6, then he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle and those that dwell in heaven. And it was granted to him to make war. Okay, this is the confirmation. He's a persecuting power to make war with the saints and to overcome them, and authority was given him over every tribe, tongue, and nation. Okay, we know who this is. All who dwell on the earth will worship him, whose names have not been written in the book of life, slain from the foundation of the world. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. And I love verse 10. Man, verse 10 should be highlighted. If you have a Bible in front of you that you're in the habit of circling, highlighting, underlining, smiley face, star, whatever symbol you want to use, you should be directing attention to verse 10, because what verse 10 says is, he who leads into captivity will go into captivity. He who kills by the sword must be killed with the sword. Here is the patience and faith of the saints. This is a key concept. It's a key idea that is central to Scripture, and it is central to God's understanding of the world, and should be central to your understanding of the world. You might remember, just to give a sort of illustration of what's being described in verse 10, when the mob came to the Garden of Gethsemane to finally arrest Jesus. Here's Jesus. He's the rabbi that's, hanging out with tax collectors and spending time with the outsiders and those that were on the fringes of Jewish society. People are attracted by the hundreds and thousands to him. He's freely walking in and around the temple, talking to all kinds of people under all kinds of circumstances, seemingly regarding no social differentiation. He had no sense of of contamination, social or otherwise, ceremonial contamination. Man, this guy, as we mentioned, he's the kind of guy you want for your neighbor, right? He's amazing. He's awesome. But he's arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. And when he's arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, he says, with no small amount of irony to the arresting mob, "Why are you coming with swords and spears to arrest me? I have been daily among you. What are you coming with violence for?" But Peter, he didn't get the memo. He didn't get the memo about this. He's like, "Look, it's war!" And he was a fisherman, not a swordsman. So he pulls out his sword, goes to give a whacking to a guy named Malchus, the Bible says. Malchus moves his head, gets his ear chopped off. Okay, not exactly the guy you want to go, let's follow him into battle. He's not very good with a sword. Jesus then, strangely enough, heals the guy's ear. Peter's like, "Oh, sorry." Heals the guy's ear, and then Jesus says, "Peter, put that thing away. He that lives by the sword will die by the sword. He that lives by the Gatling gun will die by the Gatling gun. He that lives by the Sherman tank will die by the Sherman tank. He that lives by the drone will die by the drone. He that lives by the nuclear warhead will die by the nuclear warhead." The idea that you can overcome evil with violence is an idea and a concept that is totally foreign to Scripture, totally foreign to the kingdom. And so when this power is rampaging, waging war against God and His people and His tabernacle and His name, it's waging war. The Bible just in a single verse just says, "He that leads into captivity will be led into captivity. He that kills with the sword will be killed with the sword." This is just another way of saying you reap what you sow. You reap what you sow. If you sow violence, you reap violence. If you sow paranoia, you reap paranoia. Right? If you sow discord and hostility, you reap discord and hostility. This power, this rampaging power, is obvious to us if we've been familiar, if we've been studying and are familiar with the prophecies of Daniel. Here are just a few of the identifying indicators. First of all, Daniel chapter 7, verses 8 and 20 says that the little horn, that's the image used in Daniel, was a blasphemous power. Okay, same two here. We just read it in Revelation chapter 13. In Daniel chapter 7, the little horn was a persecuting power. We just read here that this is a power that makes war against the saints. This power arises after the final dissolution of pagan Rome. We know that because the 1260-year period begins in 538. And maybe I should just pause and say a word about that. Don't take my word for it. I invite you to read almost any book on Christian history. I can recommend two: The Great Controversy by Ellen White and Church History in Plain Language by Bruce Shelley. Two right off the top of my head. If you want a more in-depth treatment of church history, you can read Yaroslav Pelikan's 5-volume series titled The Development of Christian Doctrine. It's great. It's a little more scholarly. Lots of books. You can read The History of Protestantism by Daubigny. There are lots of books that can be recommended. And here's a very important point in understanding church history and the trajectory of church history. There are two events that define church history. Now, there are lots of other events, but I just want you to imagine here, to use an illustration that I've used in another context, that you were looking at a mountain range, which is easy to understand when you're here in Colorado. I tell you, that's what I miss about. People say, "What's it like to live in Australia?" And I say, well, it's the flattest, hottest, driest continent on earth, and everything there wants to kill you, but other than that, it's great. Right? The spiders want to kill you, and the jellyfish want to kill you, and the sharks want to kill you, and the snakes want to kill you. But apart from it being hot, flat, and dry, it's beautiful. You should visit sometime. So one of the things I miss about Australia is the mountains. I tell you, just seeing the front range over there, just knowing that it's there, it's just that you could be there in an hour and a half or 2 hours drive. It's just a really beautiful thing. You don't get that view in Australia. The tallest mountain in Australia is called Mount Kosciuszko, and it's like a big round hill. It's like 8,000 feet, and when you're at the top of it, you don't even know you're at the top of it. You're like, oh, this is it? There's no view, no particular vista. I know I'm being really hard on Australia here, but here's the point of all this. Imagine that you're looking at a beautiful mountain range, and there are two peaks that are a little higher than the others. There are lots of peaks in the mountain range, lots of important summits, but there are two summits that are supremely important. I can give you church history in two events. Church history in two events. The resurrection of Jesus Christ is the taller of the two mountains. So of the two that stick up, one is taller, and that's the resurrection of Jesus. Without the resurrection of Jesus, there is no church history. Right? There is no such thing as the Christian church, and there certainly is no history of the Christian church. So the most significant event that has happened in church history is the resurrection of Jesus, okay? Now, the second, maybe I should just ask, anybody have a guess what that second peak might be? Anybody want to hazard a guess? Second Coming, that's a really good guess. I'm going prior to that. That's very important. I'll call that the end of church history. So, yeah, gotcha. Go ahead, young man.
Jesus is dead.
Okay, that actually happened before the resurrection, but a good guess again. I love your enthusiasm. Okay, the answer is the conversion of a guy named Constantine. Constantine the Great, the first Christian emperor converted, in quotations, converted to Christianity in AD 312. Those are your two mountains. Those are the two mountains that define basically church history. There are other very important mountains, but if you get these two ideas, you get most of the picture. Jesus was resurrected, and that is the beginning, and of course the highest summit in all of church history. But the conversion of Constantine places us squarely in the wake of what scholars call the Constantinian era. We here in 2016 are living in the Constantinian era. What does that mean, the Constantinian era? Well, maybe I should say it would be more precise to say we're living in the wake of the Constantinian era. Because up until the conversion of Constantine, Christianity was just a relatively obscure and unknown sect of Judaism. And Judaism was already sufficiently obscure in the Roman Empire. Just to give you a feel, the total percentage of Jews in the Roman Empire was probably not higher than about 5% and could have been as few as 2%. So you have the whole Roman Empire, right, in the latter part of, sort of the first century. Just say, for simple illustration here, the first century. So you got this whole massive Roman Empire, and if you were to do a census, the total number by percentage of people that were Jewish was between 2 and 5%. Okay, so from a Roman perspective, Christians they're just Jews. They look like Jews, talk like Jews, act like Jews, dress like Jews, eat like Jews. They're Jews. Oh, yeah, they think the Jewish Messiah has come. From a Roman perspective, who are not theologians, they don't care. They're Jews. They're Jewish people, okay? So how does this seemingly obscure, or they were certainly obscure, and small sect of another small and obscure sect, how does it become, in about 3 centuries, the most powerful, 4 centuries, 5 centuries and beyond, the most powerful force in the Roman world? Well, what happens is one of the emperors of Rome, which had historically been pagan and had persecuted the Jewish people because the Jews were monotheistic, only one God, and the Romans were polytheistic, and one of their gods was the emperor himself, Maximus, right? And so you have this massive, but a shift takes place when Constantine the Great has a vision, or what he claimed was a vision. He claimed that he saw a vision of the cross in the heavens, and this is very much in keeping with the way that the ancient world viewed gods. If my nation conquered your nation, or my tribe conquered your tribe, then it was proof positive that my God had defeated your God, and my gods were more powerful than your gods. So Constantine is about ready to go into a significant battle, a battle that is immortalized in Rome on a large bridge. There's an actual mural of a carving of the battle, and Constantine looks into heaven, allegedly and reportedly, and sees a cross. He sees a cross, and he hears these words, "In this sign, conquer." And so he's like, okay, all right, I'm going to wage this battle in the name of the God of the cross. And he wins a decisive victory. And in the wake of that decisive military victory, he's like, that's it. The God of the Christians is the true God. He converts, not a heart conversion, not a transformation in his innermost soul, but it was a simple political reality in those days. This God helped me to conquer that God, so this God is more powerful. He then declared himself to be a Christian, and the symbol of the cross was painted on Roman shields and other paraphernalia. And now you went from pagan Rome to Christian Rome. Constantine was the first of the Christian Roman emperors. This takes place in AD 312. AD 312. Now, there's lots of books that have been written about this. Probably the best is a book called Constantine's Sword. You can read about it if you're interested. Scholars debate the authenticity of Constantine's conversion. I don't debate it. There's not a doubt in my mind the guy was not converted. No way, no how, not possible. What he was trying to do was bring unity to an increasingly fragmented empire. Rome is in trouble by this point. By the time you get to the beginning of the 4th century, Rome is already beginning its slow process of dissolution. And the whole idea idea of emperor worship was one of the means by which to try and rally people around a sort of religio-patriotism to keep the empire from fragmenting into bits and pieces. So Constantine's converted in AD 312. In AD 476, just about 150 years later, the Western Roman Empire is gone. It has been divided and fragmented into what we now know today as the nations of Europe. The Eastern Roman Empire continued for a time, but the Western Roman Empire is done by AD 476. Now, a very interesting thing happens. After the dissolution of the Western Roman Empire, because you had about 150 years of Roman Christianity, where the emperors were not only emperors of Rome, imperial Rome, they were also Christians and monarchs. Now, there's a story here, a longer story that I could spend a lot of time telling you. I love teaching on church history. In 2 weeks, I'll be teaching another week-long course at the school that I run called Arise on Church History. I can give you church history in 2 events, the resurrection, the conversion of Constantine, and in 4 words. Here's the 4 words that describe Christian history, okay? Very simply. Formation, deformation, reformation, restoration. That's church history in 4 words. Let me describe. The church was formed by Christ and the apostles. It was deformed by Roman Christianity in the medieval period. It was reformed beginning in the 15th century with the Protestant Reformation and is being restored in modern times. So that's it. The church was formed, deformed, reformed, and is being restored to apostolic simplicity and purity. That's church history in 30 seconds. The big events here are the resurrection and the conversion of Constantine, because in the wake of the conversion of Constantine, the church got a taste for that most inebriating of substances, power. Power. And I wish I should have put it up on the screen here. I could show you a graph that shows the percentage of Christians in the Roman Empire after the conversion of Constantine. You went from about 3 to 5% who were Jewish and a much smaller percent who were Christian. Within 2 decades, 70% of Rome is Christian. Let that settle in. Within 2 to 3 decades, not more than 5 decades, 70% of Rome is Christian. You have a massive influx of people who are now Christian in name, but largely pagan in practice, and Christianity actually prospered in its authentic form when it was a persecuted and struggling minority religion, but when it became the big banana, when it became the big gorilla that sits wherever he wants, it began to fragment and become basically a political farce. And that is the history, basically, of the medieval church. Now, it became such an egregious farce. I almost said another word there that I didn't want to say. It actually became that too, because it was quite stinky during that period. It became such an egregious farce that finally people were like, hey! People like Martin Luther. He'll say that later, another thing that was a farce. Martin Luther's like, hey! I've been reading my Bible, and I've been looking at the church, and they don't compute. Because I can't find this, I can't find this, I can't find this, I can't find this. All of these things, all of these traditions, all of these practices that we have here in my church, I can't find in the Bible. And so he wrote out his protestations, and he went to a door in Wittenberg, to the cathedral door, and he nailed his 95 theses of protest to the door. Now this is amazing! This happened October 31st, 1517. Beloved, next year, in less than a year, it will be the 500-year anniversary of what is arguably the single event upon which Western civilization teeters. And I know exactly what I'm saying. I am not exaggerating. If there is an event upon which the whole of Western civilization teeters, you could make a very strong case that it was Martin Luther's nailing the theses of protest to the door at Wittenberg. 500 years next year. 500-year anniversary. I plan to be in Germany next year. I'm not missing this. I don't think I'll be around for the 1,000th year anniversary, so I want to be there for the 500th. Okay? I want to be there. Now, here's the point. The church became so corrupt, so different than the church that Jesus had established. Luther and others began to protest. They came to be known as Protestants. Protestants. The church had been formed by Jesus, deformed by a lust for power, right? I'm giving you the very short version, became reformed by a return to Scripture, and the battle cry of Luther and the other reformers was summarized in 2 words, in the Latin, sola scriptura. Only the Bible. Don't talk to me about councils. Don't talk to me about priests. Don't talk to me about popes. Don't talk to me about traditions. Show me from the text. Because this Jesus in here doesn't look anything like the church. It had been corrupted for a millennium of thirst and lust for power and prestige. So that's church history there in just a few minutes. Formed, deformed, reformed, restored. And that deformation began with the conversion of Constantine. We are living in the wake of the Constantinian era where the church got a taste for that corrupting and inebriating influence, power. It arises after pagan Rome, continues throughout the medieval period. We know who this power is. The sea beast is identical to the little horn of Daniel. It is the medieval church. It is the medieval church, and if time allowed, I could go into detail about how the church in Rome emerged as the primary epicenter of Western Christianity, but time does not allow us that this morning. I've recommended books for you to read. This is church history. This is not David Asscherick's opinion. I'm telling you, go read the literature. Get yourself exposed, and you'll see this is it's a simple story that you can read in greater detail, okay? Formed, deformed, reformed, restored. Okay? So this is the medieval power. They are both symbols of the medieval church. Both are symbols of the medieval church. W.D. Killen, in his book, The Ancient Church, writes this. The interval between the days of the apostles, so here we are, back in the days of the apostles, right? John, and the conversion of Constantine, there it is, there's that second big mountain. Look at what Killen says. The Christian commonwealth changed. That's an understatement. The Bishop of Rome, a personage unknown to the writers of the New Testament. They wouldn't have any idea. If you could resurrect one of the writers of the New Testament, bring him down into AD 400, AD 500, AD 600, they'd be like, who's that guy with the funny hat? Who's that guy? They'd be like, oh, that's the Bishop of Rome. He's the representative of Jesus on earth. They'd be like, don't recognize him. No idea who that is. The Bishop of Rome, a personage unknown to the writers of the New Testament, meanwhile rose into prominence and at length took precedence of all other churchmen. Rites and ceremonies of which neither Paul nor Peter ever heard crept silently into use because this massive influx of pagans, and then claimed the rank of divine institutions. Offices and officers for whom the primitive disciples could have found no place, and titles which to them would have been altogether unintelligible, began to challenge attention and to be named apostolic. So they started putting labels of apostolic and all of this. And if you could have resurrected the disciples and introduced, hey, we want you to see something. We want you to see 9th century Christianity. They would have been like, what happened? Of course, they knew what was going to happen. They actually said what was going to happen in the New Testament, but that's another story. So here's the chart that we used last seminar, from AD 538 to AD 1798, false Christianity is terrorizing the world, and true Christianity goes underground. Now we're ready for the second beast. I told you it would be 20 minutes. It was like 30. So I'm not doing very well today. Actually, I'm having a great time, which is the problem. Revelation chapter 13, verse 11. Now we're introduced to the second beast. There is near universal consensus about the identity of the first beast. It just sounds so much like the beast of the beast of Daniel chapter 7, the little horn of Daniel chapter 7. It's just like, yeah, it's a dead ringer. It's a dead ringer. But then we got this second beast, and check this out. Then I saw another beast coming up out of the earth, unlike the first beast that came up out of the sea. And he had 2 horns like a lamb, and he spoke like a dragon. I'm going to read all of it, and then we'll come back and walk through it. He exercises all the authority of the first beast in his presence and causes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast whose deadly wound was now healed. He performs great signs so that he makes even fire come down from heaven on earth in the sight of men, and he deceives those who dwell on the earth by those signs which he was granted to do in the sight of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the beast who was wounded by the sword and lived. He was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. He causes all, everybody, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark, you might have heard of this before, on their right hands or in their foreheads, and that no one might buy or sell except the one who has the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. And here is wisdom. Let him that has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. That's the second beast. Now, we're going to try and get to the bottom of who the second beast is by allowing the text to inform our conclusions. Here's an important point I want to emphasize. No one living before about, say, AD 1700 could have known who this beast was. It would have been impossible, for the simple reason that they lacked historical scope such as we now have, as we mentioned yesterday. Daniel was looking forward into prophetic obscurity, where John was looking back into historical clarity, and we now in 2016 look back and we're like, oh yeah, that's plain as the noonday sun. Babylon, Media, Persia, Greece, Rome, the little horn, the divisions of Rome, yeah, we can see it. What was obscure to them is clear to us. So scholars for a long, long time studying the prophecies of Revelation, going all the way back to the 13th and 14th centuries, would read this and say, who is this? Who is this? Who could this second beast be? And there were various ideas and perspectives and opinions, but nothing ever really stuck. Right? In the 15th century, nothing was sticking. 16th, nothing is sticking. 17th, nothing is sticking. 18th, nothing is sticking. In the 19th century, something begins to coalesce, and a picture begins to emerge as to who this second beast is. Not who he might be, but in fact who he is. Now, several things we can ask here, three questions that will get to the heart of who and what this beast is. The first question is, when does this beast arise? The second question is, where does this beast arise? And the third is, how does this beast arise, this nation? Well, the first question is when, and we've answered that from the text itself, because as the first beast was going down into captivity, he that kills by the sword will be killed by the sword, he that leads into captivity will go into captivity. John sees that beast going down. Okay, that's toward the end of the 18th century. He then sees another beast coming up. So this is real simple chronology. If it was a movie, you'd have scene 1, scene 2. Right? Scene 1, down through the medieval period, that beast goes down, becomes basically has a wound inflicted upon it that is the product of its own poor policies, and then another beast comes up. One goes down, one comes up. So the when is sometime in and around the demise of the first beast. The second question of where is actually kind of fascinating, because it says that this beast came up out of the earth. Unlike every other beast that we have seen in both Daniel and here in Daniel 7 and here in Revelation 13, which comes out of the sea. We don't have to wonder who and what this is, because Scripture tells us that these seas or these waters represent peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages. It's a populated area. We use the same language today. We'll talk about a sea of people or the ocean of humanity. So these other nations like Babylon, Media, Persia, Greece, Rome, and divided Rome, what we call Europe, came up in the old world, the populated old world. But this creature comes up in a totally different location, in the comparatively less populated area, of the earth. And then the question of how it comes up. And this is maybe the strangest verse in the entire book of Revelation. I mean, I think it is the strangest verse in the entire book of Revelation. Verse 11 says, "This power had 2 horns like a lamb, but spoke like a dragon." That is the only place where lamb and dragon appear in all of Scripture in such close juxtaposition, in a single verse. And it is pregnant with significance. 29 times the word lamb is used in the book of Revelation, and 28 times it refers to guess who. Take a guess. Refers to Jesus. This is the only time it's in reference to not Jesus, but to lamb-like principles or elements. So here you have this really tenuous, ironic juxtaposition. Lamb-like horns, i.e. Christ-like horns, speaks like a dragon. So how this power comes to be is that it will advocate a system or systems of governance that are compatible with Christ and compatible with God's with the gospel and with Christianity. Okay, so that's what we're looking for here. 2 horns like a lamb. Now, I want to emphasize again. In the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, people wondered who this beast was. They're like, man, who is that? Who is that beast that comes up after the demise of, who could that be? People could look forward and anticipate. They could see, yep, we know this is, they couldn't see it. Not because it was so complicated or difficult or mysterious and enigmatic, the prophecy, but because they didn't have the historical scope. They didn't have the historical scope. A new beast would come that would exercise governance in a Christ-like way. Its horns, the secret of its power, which is what horns represented to the Jews and in prophecy, right? Because they could see those animals, whether it was an ibex or a goat, if they had bigger horns, they had more power. So these horns are lamb-like. And in 1851, this guy here with a great beard, anybody with a beard like that deserves your attention. A guy by the name of John Nevins Andrews was the first human being in history to identify none other than the United States of America as the second beast, and he did so in 1851. Now, this is a remarkable point here, because just think about the chronology for a second. 1851, middle of the 19th century, he now lived in a time that gave him historical scope to see what somebody living in the 13th century just couldn't have seen unless they were a prophet looking forward, like John. 14th century, can't see it. 15th century, can't see it. 16th century, can't see it. 17th century, can't see it. 18th century, can't see it. 19th century, John Nevins Andrews is going into an in-depth study. You can actually Google the article. If you Google J.N. Andrews or John Nevins Andrews, 1851 article, U.S. Bible Prophecy, you can read the article. It is a tour de force of biblical reasoning. The guy was amazing. He actually says, hey, wait a minute, I think I know who this beast is. I think this beast is none other than my own nation, the United States of America. And I've got a few notes here that some new material that I want to share with you, and it's not fresh enough for me to just be able to recite it off the top of my head, so I'm going to use my notes here. J.N. Andrews was the first to identify this beast. He was a beast of biblical interpretation. J.N. Andrews was the first to identify this beast as the United States. He said that those two horns were the great twin principles upon which the United States was founded, the principles of what are called republicanism and Protestantism. Now, I know we've fallen into common parlance of referring to the United States as a democracy, but in fact, it is a republic, as you would know if you ever recited the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag and to the republic for which it stands. And what Andrew said is, hey, look, what makes America so special? What makes it such a unique governmental system? In fact, it was so unique that it was called the American experiment. I mean, this was a crazy idea in America. The idea was, if you can believe it, I mean, this is like the punchline to a joke. Can you imagine? They think they can govern themselves without a king, without a monarchy or royalty. Sipping the Kool-Aid, right? Sipping the tea, as it were. It was absurd. Right? Because up to this point, throughout human history, there's been this idea that royalty possessed something in their blood that enabled them to rule. And if you were of the ruling class, the landlords, then you were royal and you could rule. And if you weren't, then you were the peasants. This was this notion of a lower class and a ruling, an upper class. Okay? Now, one of the things that's going to emerge out of this is a totally revolutionary idea, and it was given birth to in the United States of America. It's what we now refer to as the, what do you think I'm going to say here? Middle class. This is a totally revolutionary concept, that you would have a class of people who are not the poorest of the poor who are being reigned over, neither are they the ruling elite, but that there's in the middle, and a middle class, it was a joke. And if it wasn't a joke, it was an experiment. Hey, let's see if we can have a system of governance that is not built upon royalty and royal blood, and is not built upon the Pope and the church insisting on its various ways. Let's try to do this differently. Let's have republicanism and Protestantism, i.e., civil liberty and religious liberty. Let's try that. Let's see if that'll work. And again, they were just like, not going to happen. Not going to happen. Won't work. It's a flawed concept of government. A country without a king or a pope. Can you imagine? And yet in 1776, when the Declaration of Independence was declared from England, these words were written. These words are revolutionary. I mean, truly, socially and governmentally and politically revolutionary. You can go through some 5,000 years of recorded human history, and you don't come across anything quite like this, except in the writings of Moses, but that's another story. The Declaration of Independence, 1776, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Let me translate that for you. Duh. Obvious. Duh. What are these duh truths? That all men are created equal. That they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The watchword of the American experiment was liberty. Give me liberty or give me... That was the watchword of the American experiment. Liberty, freedom from a king, freedom from a pope. I just want my own plot of land. I want to go out there. I want to plant some carrots. I want to have some cows, and I'm just going to live out there on my own. Leave me alone. Basically, pretty much. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. The job of the government is to ensure that the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are held up, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Deriving their power from the consent of the governed. So liberty and the idea that you would be governed by consent and not by force. If you're into books, you should read the book, a very great book, a wonderful book, and if you're into reading, you should read, if you've not already, Dave McCullough's book, John Adams. Has anybody here read the book? It's an outstanding book, yes or no? For the three of you that have read it. Okay, if you're not into books that are about as, thick as your lower leg, then you can watch the movie. It's actually the television series, and it's outstanding. Outstanding. How many people here have seen the John Adams HBO series? It's a 10 out of 10. You need to, this evening, go to your computer, get on iTunes, and download John Adams and watch it. It is phenomenal. It's based on the book. It is amazing. It gives you a real sense, a real immersive sense of how this nation was founded and the radical nature of the American experiment. I tell you, I'm not somebody who generally recommends movies, but I recommend this without exception. I watched it with my boys. I'm like, boys, sit down. You're going to learn something about this amazing nation called the United States of America. So get your hands on that book as a good introduction, or on the movie by HBO, John Adams. Outstanding. The United States Constitution, 1789. You're paying attention to the dates. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote general welfare, and secure the blessings, say it with me, of liberty. To ourselves and our posterity do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Largely written by a man named Thomas Jefferson. Incidentally, the French Revolution had taken place before this, and the French were in the midst of actually undergoing a very similar transformation, and Thomas Jefferson was responsible for largely writing significant pieces of what would become the equivalent of the French Constitution as well. Fascinating story, the play and interplay of the American Revolution and the French Revolution, and it's well documented in the John Adams books and movie. The First Amendment. Okay, so here's what happens. A couple years after the Constitution is written and signed, people are like, man, this is kind of dangerous. It's a little dangerous here because we got this power, and we have the federal power, and we have our state powers, and we have the judicial power, but there is a danger here that if there's not some protection for the citizenry, that this could just turn into another nation like the old world nations of Europe. So you could have the equivalent of a monarchy that could emerge, right? Not by royal blood, but we need to ensure that can't happen. And so they passed the Bill of Rights, which was the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. They had some time to think about it, and they went back and said, okay, these are the essential amendments to the Constitution that we've written, and the first, not the second, not the third, what was the sensitivity? What was the cultural and situational sensitivity in those days? It was religious freedom. Because many of them had either themselves lived in Europe or had parents or grandparents who'd lived in Europe, and they knew the story. They knew this story of more than 1,000 years of medieval suffering. They knew that story. So just like you and I, like the most important problem for us today is my Wi-Fi is not working. The Wi-Fi, the password's not working. Is it a capital M or not? The Wi-Fi is not working. Okay? We have what are called first world problems. What do you mean I didn't get the upgrade? I'm gold. I need the upgrade. First world problems. Okay? Hey, my cappuccino, I ordered it without the pumpkin spice. Okay? First world problems. In the days of the founders of the United States of America, they were like, hey, we're really concerned about religious totalitarianism. We're really concerned about religious persecution. So when they came down to establish the Bill of Rights, here's what they said. This was the question and the concern that was burning in their bosom. Congress shall make no law respecting and, what is this? Establishment of religion, called the Establishment Clause. No religion will be the formal religion of the United States of America, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, of whatever religious inclination you might have, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Again, you just cannot emphasize how unique